be blanked out, but I can talk a little bit first and make sure we get enough lead time. Yeah, what you said is quite correct. The person who is free of an attack has with him um, several characteristics that are related to his condition, and one of them is that he doesn't want to talk about it. He feels uneasy in discussing it. Then, as if somehow there's almost a superstition connected with it that you never know at what moment. What we call spontaneity, and so for a long time they are walking gingerly on eggs, eggshells, not not challenging the situation. And some of the things that they avoid or should avoid, in my experience, has been taking naps is not a good thing for a person prone to depersonalization. Again, we have an alteration of consciousness. During sleep, the mind and the brain is geared for sleep and for the transition. During the daytime, it may not be, and who knows. But after taking naps, many of these people feel worse. And also they avoid strange and unusual circumstances. They don't want to go to amusement parks or fun houses or places where things are distorted or unreal looking and so on. They really do. They avoid them like the plague. They just won't want to be part of it. And so that's another curious phenomenon, that they will tend to stay away from circumstances that would, for example, I had a patient who went to a resort, and on stage there was a stage hypnotist, and he took people at random out from the audience, and he took my patient, and my patient said no. In other words, even though he put a lot of pressure on, wild horses couldn't drag him down there. He didn't know what hypnosis would do to that delicately balanced conscious level of his. So these are good things to know. And so in many ways, if you dig deeply enough, you can find certain very fascinating traits that begin to appear in people who have recovered from this, and as a consequence to the condition. So that comes to mind. And then these stories, again, getting back to them, some of them end with a happy ending where they get rid of their depersonalization, and that's either accomplished by long-term medication, but I'm not quite sure about that. And I'm not even quite sure about why one should do well on imipramine and another should not do well on imipramine. Now, all of that begins to make you wonder if there isn't more than one type of depersonalization. Now, what would that mean? That because the sensations are the same, or reasonably the same as best as we could tell, how could there be more than one kind? Well, it may be the intensity may be different, that the different kinds of depersonalization may be based on how strongly the depersonalization is. People might have this in a more moderate form, and some people may have it in a more severe form. And it may look as if it were two separate conditions. Otherwise, we're faced with the variety of ways. Otherwise, we're faced with the variety of ways that people get depersonalized. And that needs to be examined too. What are the triggers, and why are there so many different types of triggers? Let's start this in a person, let's say, who has never had it before. So if we're examining it closely for research, you'd want to certainly look at that. Another area which we've already alluded to, which needs a lot of attention, is to train all of our heavy-duty brain scanning equipment onto these people. in the last 5 years or 10 years at the most, there have been SPECT scans and CAT scans and God knows what to see if there's any variation in brain function, even in gross fashion as this is. That should be looked at as well. Again, the mystery of how it switches on back and forth is still not clear. And there's nothing that yet presents us with any evidence for it. Changes, forceful changes in consciousness. We don't know what the long-term evidence is for whether the people who are intermittent depersonalizers as opposed to chronic steady depersonalizers. But the idea of depression is not unusual. In many medical conditions, when there is a trigger or a predisposition, then something happens. For example, in depression, it's almost cliche to say that it could have a psychological trigger, but a physiological effect. So here we may be dealing with that. The thing that starts you off might be psychological, but once it happens that way, it stays that way through physiological. You've altered something physical in the person. There's ample evidence to believe that there are a lot of conditions in that fashion. People with depression will say that they did all right until their mother died, let's say, or something like that, or something happened. The evidence for that in depersonalization is not as clear as it is in depression, what the trigger would be. And then we have back to the old, it happens without any antecedent. So what are we going to do? But nevertheless, that does happen. A psychological event can become a physical one. It'd be very interesting to cull the literature. And here I think I have enough stories about people who, I don't know whether you'd call it depersonalized, but they certainly go into an altered state of consciousness when they're alone, or in solitary confinement, or when there's a marked dearth of external stimuli. Now that's another interesting notion, that the person with depersonalization feel worse when he is all alone and has nothing coming in. And that would mean that we have two sets of stimulation, that which comes from within and that which comes from without. And we're kept in balance by a reasonable amount of each. And that some depersonalized people feel better when they're talking to somebody, when they're engaged in that. We spoke of distraction before, but it might be this business of when you're alone, the internal stimulation gets larger in proportion to the external, and that might be partly the trigger for depersonalization. I don't think derealization is. I've always had some strong reservations about it. It was made into two separate entities, but I don't think they're separate. I think that some depersonalized people have derealization as a form of their depersonalization, and others don't. But I don't think there's like a separate condition. For example, I've never heard of, nor did I ever see, a person who was derealized without being depersonalized. So it's hard for me to see that as a pure entity. You know what I mean? Suddenly becoming a victim of derealization. There is still some question as to whether hormonal changes have any effect on this. I haven't seen very much of that. I can't comment, really. I would be extremely interested to see what the incidence of this condition is cross-culturally, namely in different cultures, do they have as many cases? This is, of course, a very difficult problem. We're having enough trouble in English trying to describe what the condition is like. Can you imagine trying to describe it in Russian or whatever? So you'd have to have a very sensitive person or whatever, a clever person to be able to elicit the proper kind of responses. But that would be true. And it also, another thing comes to mind. Would there be a larger a number of people depersonalized in cultures like in the Far East, and where meditation is practiced, and or being alone for long periods of time, where, in a sense, if you can put it this way, depersonalization is sought after, like in samadhi, a condition called samadhi, where they go out of the body and so on. Now, at this point, we're at the threshold of dissociative phenomenon, and that's a whole other story, and that has its own rhyme and reason to it, dissociative phenomena, and that has a separate place in the psychiatric lexicon. Dissociation, which under it includes out of the body experience, multiple personality, fugue states, states of amnesia, and so on. These are not found in depersonalization. I'm not sure. I don't think anyone has ever tried. I don't know. I was going to venture a guess that it would be hard to hypnotize them, but maybe it wouldn't. And then again, how would they respond? Would it take them out of it? Would it make it worse? I have no idea. Something to think about. Them a suggestion that they're going to feel differently. That's a good point. Yeah, that's right. That's certainly worth doing. But I don't know if you have, but I don't see a single instance of anyone going to hypnotherapy for this. No. So I don't know. We have a mixed picture, we don't know. We have, something that we're enforcing on others, and who knows the circumstances and, the conditions under which it's done. I'm not clear that these people in prisons and so on are depersonalized in the same sense that we're using it, or that they are simply the victims of continual abuse and lack of companionship. Would be very instructive. I go back to this again, to study the pre-morbid personality. But we don't know who's going to become depersonalized, so you can't give psychological tests to everybody and then determine which people were more at risk for depersonalization than others. That would be an extremely interesting prospect, to know who's at risk and say, you are a candidate for being depersonalized at some time in your life or whatever. The only thing I could think of would be if they had a history of it. That would give you some clue. Yeah, and yeah, well, there are a lot of intelligent and sensitive people in the world. And, so that doesn't give you a very specific marker, as we call it. You'd have to pick some trait which is more specific than that, One of the thoughts I had was if they have a high dissociative index, meaning that they can go out of the body and do that, maybe that would be a clue to depersonalization, but that didn't hold up. And another would be if you saw people who were prone to daydreaming and being in reverie and so on. But here we have an aspect of this which neatly sidesteps all the other, and that is the use of drugs. Why would marijuana, a drug which is used, I don't know, maybe by half the population in America right now, and the few people that have reported becoming depersonalized from it. What does that tell us? That when it's like if the seed falls on fertile ground, it'll grow. If it doesn't fall on fertile ground, it won't grow. So that the people that smoke marijuana who have a predisposition to depersonalization would have it. And there have been a few people in my study who have had ongoing, but not severe, depersonalization as a consequence of taking drug use. So that throws it into another category. Now, you could ask yourself whether the depersonalization caused by pot is the same as other spontaneous depersonalization. Well, from everything we know about it, it doesn't seem to be any different, that it just threw them into it. And that is also something. Does the pot deal with those features of the brain that control consciousness and unconsciousness and put you in a state of mind where that barrier or the gateway from one to the other has been impaired? I don't know. And some people, they can't bring it back together again. That argues very strongly against the psychological cause, by the way. It's a little too facile to determine that being in the age of virtual reality, that where we're surrounded by events where we are spectators, the television, for example, constantly, movies and the like, we're just filled, the day is filled with activities where we're spectators and so on. And does all this lead to a milieu which encourages depersonalization? Perhaps. Virtual reality is a perfect example. There are people who wear these goggles, and then when they take them off, they have to see the world around them in another way. Maybe can't make the transition properly, and so on. And we should get some more evidence from people who have been in those tanks, sensory deprivation tanks, whether they've had any effect on depersonalization. Woody Allen in the movie called, I don't know what it was called now, something Pearl of the Nile or whatever, was where a man plays out the characters. Purple Road to Cairo, where a man played the role that in a movie that was his life. In other words, he played the movie's role in his real life.
What was that one recently with Jim Carrey?
Groundhog Day. No. The Truman Show is another example of where you're surrounded by an artificial reality. Now, what does all that do to your reality testing? It's awfully tempting to say that there are certain people who are, that this is an ego problem, and that there are certain people whose egos are strong and well put together and whose sense of themselves is assured and well protected. And these are the ones who are least liable to have this, while those who are insecure about who they are and what they are and so on, that's awfully tempting. In fact, that sucked in a lot of people in terms of that this is a problem in ego psychology, and all you have to do is build up the ego and so on. But no, they haven't been very successful in building up the ego. And even, for example, depersonalized people who get plaudits in life and who get advancements in salary and the like, that doesn't cure their depersonalization or their self-image, as it were. So this thing is a big self-image problem. I emphatically do not believe that, although it is very tempting to believe it and say, well, that, like I said in my story, where you wake up in Mammoth Cave, where the ones people who are held together very flimsily by their psychic development, were the ones who would go first, And here you would see the training that the astronauts have to go through in order to take out the people who will become unhinged if they were presented with extraordinarily unusual circumstances, so on. A problem of controlling, that they slip out of control once they find they can't control something. Then it just, yeah. Well, again, these are psychological constructs. And when you stop to think, we're just talking words. What are we talking about? Words about a person who has this, has that, a certain type of person. There's not much substance to that, and not much proof to it. So even though it may be true, we don't have any really serious way of handling it. And then again, if any of these things are amenable to medicines, that also questions the purely psychological basis, like the fact that as a child, when you have very life-threatening situations, you split and be there and not be there at the same time, which is the basis of depersonalization for some people. It's the inability for you to withstand that external event without having to escape from it in some way. And the only way that's possible is, like a child with a parent, is by depersonalizing. So you're really not daddy. You're not with daddy, even though you're standing next to him. You've taken leave. Well, those are the things that we have to do, is to set them all out and see if there are, and your word links, if there are links to each other. But I would approach it another way, was to look at any condition that impairs consciousness and see whether that has anything to offer. But I certainly would want to know what relationship migraine and epilepsy has to this, although I haven't met many people, I don't know if you have, in these case histories that are epileptic. I haven't seen any. Maybe you have. I haven't seen a one.
I've only heard reference during.
Oh yeah, I've seen that, and that also, yeah, you're right. It may open up a door to something, but I don't see epilepsy as being a part of the personality of people who become depersonalized. I haven't seen it. There may be, I can't emphasize strongly enough the fact that these cases do not necessarily cut to the heart of the depersonalized person. We're not studying people in hospitals who have been put there because they can't function. We're not studying people who haven't been on the web and whatever and so on. So we have a sample, not to be sneezed at, but we haven't a recidivist sample. That means a sample of people that have been, been put away or can't function. And I would really strongly suggest that we try to find something like that. I think so. Absolutely. For example, I could call up, when I call Phoebe up, and ask her how many of these cases that she knows are hospitalized Mount Sinai. We're postulating a chemical origin for this. Of course, serotonin plays a part, but whether it is the sole situation. What I really would like to know more about is the chemistry of sleep and wakefulness. How does the chemistry of your brain change when you're asleep as opposed to when you're awake? That will offer some interesting, it seems to me, tidbits right there. But you're right. And that accounts for the fact that not all the medicines work the same way that these people have had. They've had a handful, an armful of different remedies. One of them has been specific. There are differences. There are very specific differences, but they're not differences that these drug companies thought was significant because they felt the end result was the same, namely, they were both used for depression, but they are different.